Welcome to Blackwell's, Laura. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you here. In your new book, Misogynation, you compile a series of articles and testimonies from your Everyday Sexism Project, giving voice once again to women and connecting the dots that allow us to see the big picture. For those who might not know about you and your crusade, can you tell us a bit more about this project and why did you start writing?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I started the Everyday Sexism Project in 2012 because I started to realise just how many women I knew who were experiencing different forms of sexism or discrimination or harassment or abuse on a weekly, if not daily basis. But when we tried to talk about it, we were often told we were making a fuss about nothing, that women are equal now. There's no such thing as sexism. You needed to just learn to smile or get a sense of humour or take it as a compliment. You've got the wrong end of the stick. Lots of reasons why we shouldn't make a fuss. And I started to realise that actually when you look at the bigger picture, it is okay to talk about this. It was a really major issue, but it was, I think, quite an invisible problem. So I started the project to try and bring the reality of these stories and these women's lives into the open. And I started writing because the stories that came in were shocking and they demanded a voice and a bigger platform. I thought that maybe 50 people would share their stories with me, and instead over 100,000 people sent me their testimonies within just 3 years. So I started writing to try and make sense of it all, to try and draw out some of the themes and perhaps some of the lessons, and to try and give those stories an even bigger voice and audience.
Absolutely. I think sometimes we don't realise how intricate, how rooted in society sexism really is. Many people simply won't even stop to think about it. When did you start having this ability to see that's so characteristic of you?
I think what happened for me was that it was a week when several things happened very close together, and it made me see things differently. It literally was like a kind of shutters coming away from my eyes. It was a week by complete coincidence where a man followed me home very aggressively, sexually propositioning me and refusing to take no for an answer, and then saying eventually that he would just follow me and then he would know where I lived. And then a few nights later I was on the way home on the bus quite late at night. I was on the phone to my mum, and the man next to me ran his hand up my legs and grabbed my crotch. And when I said out loud what was happening, I'm on the bus, this man just groped me. Everyone heard and everyone looked out the window. Nobody stepped in, nobody supported me, nobody challenged him, nobody even made eye contact. And it made me feel incredibly embarrassed and ashamed that I shouldn't have said something, that I'd done something wrong. And actually years later I looked back and realised it sent him a pretty powerful message as well. You can get away with this. No one will interfere. No one will say that this isn't okay. And there were several other incidents around the same time, being shouted at in the street, having men quite graphically describing my body to each other. And I sat down at the end of this period, this week, and I just thought, if these things hadn't happened so close together, I might never have thought twice about any one of them, because it was really normal to be treated in that way, to have those kinds of experiences. That was the sort of light bulb moment for me, realising that it was normal, realising just how much I'd become used to it because it was just part of being a woman.
Are there any particular authors that influenced you or books that you treasured? Maybe that you feel that opened your eyes, like this book, Misogynation, might open other people's eyes?
Oh, I hope so. That's such a nice thought. What's interesting for me, really, honestly, is that when I was growing up, I was a voracious reader, I was a real bookworm, but I didn't know anything about feminism. No one ever told me about feminism, no one ever talked to me about women's rights or the women's movement. And so I think for me, looking back, I learned about feminist concepts and ideas through books which weren't necessarily explicitly feminist texts. So I hadn't read a lot of the kind of great feminist icons books, but I'd grown up reading books where the characters rebelled against the straitjackets of societal stereotypes, and I'm thinking of, you know, even really quite old-fashioned books like Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, for example, and learning through books like that about the kind of ideas and attitudes, I suppose, that formed my idea of feminism later on. Or another example, I guess, is something like Noughts and Crosses by Malorie Blackman, which is such a fabulous book because it really explores issues around social justice and racial injustice, but through an incredible and gripping storyline. So for me, that was very special, I think, growing up to learn those ideas without necessarily being explicitly taught about them.
We've seen a boost on women's empowerment this year, women writing, women selling books like never before, feminism everywhere. And how do we make sure that this is not just a trend, but something that, you know, is going to stick around?
I think it's funny, you know, to hear it described as a trend, and I've seen that. I've seen some uncharitable articles about some of the newest books that are coming out, especially those which are kind of collections of great women's lives and stories about them, kind of suggesting, you know, this is a bandwagon, it's a trend, it's people kind of taking advantage. And I just think, my God, you know, these centuries that we've had of millions of books being written by old white men and about old white men, and no one has ever stopped to comment on it. And suddenly, wonderfully, we've got this breath of fresh air, this clutch of a few wonderful books coming out about women. And already people are saying, oh, it's too many, you know, it's a trend, it's overdone. I think we need many, many more. I think there is room for all of them. And I think we're seeing such variety and such vibrancy, so many exciting new books coming out, exploring these kinds of ideas in so many different ways. And I think it's fantastic, and I'm looking forward to many more. I think we have to stop seeing this as a trend. We've got to stop seeing this. I've heard a lot of people saying things like, you know, this is the year of women. And I just think, well, hang on a minute, 1 year? Are you kidding? You know, we need more. Hopefully this is the year that we wake up to the fact that women are fantastic writers and reviewers and philosophers and thinkers, and then we take that forward and we treat them as writers and philosophers and thinkers, not women writers, you know, not chick lit, not a female-led film, but just a film that for once, or a book or whatever it is treating women equally to men, and it shouldn't be remarkable anymore.
Well, I hope so. I surely hope so. Sometimes talking about the things that happen to us, sharing personal experience can be really difficult, very painful. Sometimes even stop to think about it can be difficult, or something we don't really want to do. And finding, or I think that, and for me personally, finding more and more people that are sharing their stories, that they've been through very similar things, and that understand your frustrations, that are there to listen and that want to share, can be a huge help. So I guess my question is, how important is it for women to speak out, to find their own voice, like we've seen with the Me Too movement?
I think it's impossible to overstate the importance of it. The stories that we hear, the voices that we hear, change the way that we think and the way that we shape the world and what we consider to be possible and what we consider to be acceptable. And for too long, those voices and those stories have been men's voices and men's stories. And I think you're right, it's so important, actually, we don't say this enough, that the act of telling that story can be deeply painful. It can take such courage for someone to tell a story that perhaps they've had buried inside of themselves for a long time. Many of the women I hear from who send their stories to the Everyday Sexism Project will say that this is something that happened to them decades ago, and that they have lived with the pain of it for years because the world has made them feel that it was their own fault, that they don't have the right to talk about it, that they should be ashamed. And to strip away that shame and to feel able for the first time to tell your story and to have your story believed and listened to, not dismissed, not brushed off, not forced back into the shadows, but simply for people to say, I believe you. It's immeasurably important, I think. So the courage of the voices of those people who've stepped forward over the last year, I think it just can't be underestimated. And I feel that we're so lucky, actually, that their bravery has helped us to recognise the scale of this problem. And now it's other people's job, really, to step up and to start changing things.
There are many hideous differences that separate us from childhood. You talk about them in Misogynation. Girls are usually taught to be more empathetic, to care for others, to listen and to understand and think about their feelings. We are sharers of feelings. I like to say from a very young age we spend a lot of time talking about them with our best friends and so on. Do you think this could have actually helped us form an alliance in this massive empathetic force, able to understand and care for each other that we're seeing these days?
Absolutely, I think you're right. We socialise women and girls to be much more empathetic, to be much more caring of each other's feelings, but also much better about expressing our own feelings. And there's a huge strength in that, and a solidarity and a support network, which many men and boys lack. And actually, I think that's a really good example of one of the ways, the many ways in which gender inequality has a negative impact on men and boys. You know, we bring boys up in a world that tells them boys don't cry and don't touch a dolly and you can't play with certain toys and you're not expected to be emotional, you're expected to be strong and manly. And if you look at the media, you'll see examples of men who are violent, men who are protectors, men who are strong and masculine in a very specific and narrow sense of what that means to be a man. And what that means is that for men and boys who are bewildered by mental health issues, by problems that they come up against, they don't have that same support network to reach out to. And tragically, I think that's one of the reasons we see such a high suicide rate amongst men, that they are not able in the same way to reach out, for example, for support with mental health problems, because there is such stigma around men expressing their emotions. So I think that it's a real double-edged sword, and it's just a really good example actually of the way in which this has negative repercussions for all of us.
Yeah, even though there's much to be done here in the UK, we are in a relatively better position than many other places around the world, and we do care for each other. So is it in your plans to try to reach out? Have you thought about ways of bringing more people into the conversation?
Yes, from quite early on actually, women were writing from all over the world saying, we've heard about what you're doing and we need this here as well. And we started hearing their stories globally. We heard from a woman in Argentina who tried to ignore 4 men catcalling her from their car, only to find that they screeched to a halt and tried to drag her in. Or a woman in Mexico who was told by her university professor, "Calladita te ves más bonita," you look prettier when you shut up. Or a 12-year-old girl who was trying to have a picnic in a park in France with her sister when a man came and exposed himself to them. A woman in India too afraid to report the man with the erection pressed into her back on the train. I think what's really important is to recognise that there is so much that we have in common and that we can learn from each other and from the struggles that women around the world are fighting where they are, and not to think that this is a one-size-fits-all approach that we export elsewhere, but rather to recognise that feminists in countries everywhere in the world are doing the important work that needs to be done on the ground. And so many of them have taken and started their own versions of the Everyday Sexism Project because they're best placed to know how it should best work where they are. But it's interesting actually, because when I started Everyday Sexism, a lot of people said to me, you know, women in the UK are so lucky, look at women elsewhere. And actually, I think there is an understatement there. I think people want to point a finger elsewhere, and I think people don't realise that we live in a country where 1/4 of women experience domestic violence, where 85,000 women are raped every year, and over 2 women a week are killed by a current or former partner. So I also want to stress that the most serious human rights abuses are happening right here at home as well.
Talking about reaching out, I'd like to ask you a final question about one of your articles published 10th of January 2014. It's one that touched me particularly, and it's in this new book, Misogynation. You talk about the pressure young girls go through, and wrote the testimony of a 15-year-old girl that said, and I quote, "I always feel like I don't look a certain way. If boys don't think I'm sexy or hot, then I have failed. And it doesn't matter if I'm a doctor or a writer, I'll still feel like nothing." You say this is us who are failing them, and I couldn't agree more. They deserve better. Besides working against the negative influences that affect the young people, how else can we reach a younger audience, particularly the ones that would despise a talk in their schools, or whose parents would never come to one of your talks? How key is the media in all this?
Well, I think that the media is so key, and I think that young people are just so important. That was the first project entry that ever made me cry. I remember it so vividly, and it just made me think, if we're bringing up our girls to feel like they are nothing, the messages we're sending them are so overwhelming, then how can we tackle any of this? It starts so young. We know actually that 1/4 of 7-year-olds have dieted to lose weight. That's how bad the problem is and how early it starts. So I think part of it is about changing the entire atmosphere of schools. We know that there's a real problem around sexual violence in schools at the moment, and that body image impacts very young children. So along with other women's organisations, I've spent a lot of time over the last years lobbying the government to put sex and relationships education on the curriculum, to try and make sure that every child from a young age is learning very simple messages about healthy relationships and about gender stereotypes and about attitudes towards their body. But as you say, the media has a really big role to play in this as well, and if the media is continuing to bombard us with an incredibly narrow, unrealistic, airbrushed image of what it means to be a woman, then we'll continue to really struggle against that stereotype, I think. But you're right, not everybody will necessarily be coming to a talk or you know, signing up for something like that. And so for me, I think it goes back a little bit in terms of how we reach those children to what was reaching me at that age. I'm very aware that I wasn't going to talks about feminism. I didn't even know what it was, but as I said, it was fiction books for me that really spoke to me and helped me learn and get a sense of who I was in the world. So I'm actually writing a fiction book, a young adult fiction book, which is due to come out next year, which deals with a lot of these kinds of topics. But it's very much based on my experiences of talking to girls in schools up and down the country about what they're going through and what their lives are really like, because I think a lot of people have no idea of what they're being bombarded with. So I'm hoping that that book, it's called The Burning. I'm hoping that that will help as another way of reaching out.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading your new book. Thank you very much for coming, Laura, and thank you for all your hard work. It's been a pleasure to have you here at Blackwells.
Thank you so much for having me.